My son called me dead weight in front of 12 board members, and they all laughed. I grabbed my purse, walked straight to my car, and drove to the airport. 3 hours later, I was on a plane to Austin with nothing but my credit card and a fury that could power the entire state of Texas. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in that humiliating boardroom in the first place. 3 months earlier, my husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack at 59, leaving me to navigate not just my grief, but also his position as CEO of Anderson Tech Solutions, the company we'd built together over 25 years. David, our 32-year-old son, had been working his way up through the company, and everyone naturally assumed he'd step into his father's shoes. I should have seen the signs. The way David started scheduling meetings without including me. How he'd dismiss my suggestions with a patronizing smile and a, "Let me handle the business side, Mom." The subtle eye rolls when I'd ask questions about quarterly reports or client relationships I'd helped nurture since before he could spell entrepreneur. But I was drowning in grief, barely keeping my head above water, so I let it slide. I thought he was just eager to prove himself, maybe a little overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility. Robert had always planned to transition leadership gradually, but cancer doesn't wait for convenient timing. The morning of that fateful board meeting, David had asked me to attend what he called a strategic planning session. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, wearing my navy blue suit and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. I thought I was there as a partner, a founding member of the company who still held 30% of the shares. I was wrong. The moment I walked into that conference room, I could feel the tension. Our longtime attorney, Marcus Webb, wouldn't make eye contact. Sarah Chen, our head of operations, kept fidgeting with her pen. Even Janet Morrison, who'd been with us since the company's second year, seemed unusually interested in her notebook. David stood at the head of the table, all confidence and expensive suit, looking every inch the successful executive. "Good morning, everyone," he said, flashing that charming smile that used to melt my heart when he was 5 years old. "I've called this meeting to discuss some necessary changes as we move forward." He clicked on his laptop, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the screen. The first slide read, "Streamlining operations for maximum efficiency." I settled into my chair, expecting to hear about departmental restructuring or maybe new software systems. Instead, David launched into a speech about eliminating redundancies and removing obstacles to progress. He talked about the need for fresh perspectives and modern approaches to leadership. For 20 minutes, he danced around his point with corporate buzzwords and management speak. Then he clicked to a slide that made my blood freeze. Cost analysis, non-essential personnel. My name was at the top of the list. "As you can see," David continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he'd perfected in business school, "we have several positions that don't contribute directly to our bottom line. People who are here more for sentimental reasons than business necessity." That's when he said it. The words that would echo in my mind for months afterward. Time to cut the dead weight, starting with Mother. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious exactly. More like nervous chuckling from people who didn't know how to react to such a brutal dismissal of a company founder. But it hit me like a slap across the face nonetheless. I sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. My own son had reduced me to dead weight in front of people I'd hired, mentored and considered family, people who'd attended Robert's funeral and hugged me while I cried. The old Margaret would have argued. She would have reminded everyone in that room about the clients she'd brought in, the crises she'd navigated, the 25 years of 16-hour days that built the foundation David was now standing on. She would have fought for her place at the table. But the woman who stood up that morning was someone new entirely. I didn't say a word. I simply gathered my purse, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, I turned back one last time. "David," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I hope you remember this moment when you realize what you've just thrown away." And then I left. Not just the meeting, not just the building, but my entire life as I'd known it. That's when I realized I had two choices: stay and fight for scraps of respect from people who clearly didn't value me, or disappear completely and start over somewhere nobody knew me as Robert Anderson's widow, or David Anderson's mother? Guess which one I chose. Packing a life into 3 suitcases teaches you what really matters, and apparently what mattered to me fit in a carry-on. Everything else was just expensive clutter I'd been dragging around for decades, thinking it made me important. I had exactly 4 hours between leaving that boardroom and my flight to Austin. 4 hours to close one chapter of my life and crack open another. Most people would call that insane. I called it efficient. The house felt different when I walked back in, like it belonged to someone else now. Robert's reading chair still had his coffee-stained armrest. The family photos on the mantel showed a woman who smiled too much and asked for too little. I looked at that woman and felt sorry for her. First, I called Janet Morrison, our longest-serving employee, and the only person in that boardroom who'd looked genuinely uncomfortable during David's performance. "Margaret?" she answered on the first ring. "Are you okay? What just happened in there was—" "Janet," I interrupted, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions." A pause. "Of course. What do you need?" "Access to the client contact database. I want my own copy." Another pause. Longer this time. "Margaret, you know I can't—" "Janet." My voice carried a tone I'd never used with her before. "I helped hire you when you were fresh out of college and couldn't get an interview anywhere else. I trained you myself, stayed late countless nights to make sure you succeeded. I'm not asking you to steal company secrets. I'm asking you to email me information that I helped create." Silence stretched between us. Then, "Give me your personal email. You'll have it in 20 minutes. Next, I called my banker. Thomas Richardson had been handling our accounts for 15 years, and he knew the family dynamics better than most therapists. "Mrs. Anderson, I heard about Robert. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Thomas. I need to make some changes to my accounts, immediately." "Of course. What can I help you with?" "I want to transfer my personal funds to a new account at a different bank. I want all statements going to a P.O. box, and I want David removed from any emergency contact lists." The silence told me everything. Word traveled fast in Seattle's business community. "Mrs. Anderson, are you sure this is the right time to make major financial decisions? Grief can—" "Thomas," I said, cutting him off the same way I had Janet. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. How quickly can this be done? If you come in within the hour, we can have most of it processed by end of business today." While I was at the bank, I stopped by Nordstrom and bought what I called my new life wardrobe. Not the conservative suits and sensible shoes I'd been wearing for decades, but clothes that actually reflected who I was underneath all that corporate respectability. Flowing pants, silk blouses in colors that made me feel alive, boots that had attitude. The saleswoman, a stylish woman about my age named Rita, looked at me curiously. "New job?" she asked. "New everything," I replied, handing her my credit card. By 6 p.m., I was at SeaTac Airport with 3 suitcases, a laptop bag, and a first-class ticket to Austin. I'd chosen Austin for one simple reason. It was as far from Seattle's tech scene as I could get while staying in America. Different culture, different climate, different everything. As I waited at my gate, my phone buzzed with calls from David. The first few went to voicemail. Then came the texts. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk. This is ridiculous. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. Janet said you had her send you files. That's company property." I turned off my phone without responding. The old Margaret would have felt guilty about the worry I was causing. The new Margaret figured David had made his bed when he called me dead weight in front of our employees. The flight attendant who escorted me to my first-class seat was a cheerful woman named Carmen, who couldn't have been older than David. "First time to Austin?" she asked as I settled in. "First time anywhere without a return ticket," I admitted. Carmen's eyes lit up with understanding. Running away or running towards something? I thought about that as the plane lifted off, watching Seattle shrink beneath the clouds. "Both," I finally answered. During the 3-hour flight, I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself imagine a completely different life, not as Robert Anderson's widow or David Anderson's mother, but as Margaret Anderson, a woman who was just getting started. I pulled out my laptop and did what any good businesswoman does when she's about to enter unknown territory. Research. Austin's economy was booming. The tech scene was exploding, but still young enough that an experienced consultant could make a real impact. The cost of living was reasonable, the culture embraced reinvention, and the weather would be a welcome change from Seattle's eternal drizzle. By the time we began our descent, I had a plan forming, not just for survival, but for something bigger, something that would make David's little power play look like a child having a tantrum. When the plane touched down in Austin, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about tomorrow. The woman who'd left Seattle that morning was carrying baggage that had nothing to do with luggage. The woman who stepped off that plane in Texas was traveling light in every sense of the word. That night, in a downtown hotel room overlooking Lady Bird Lake, I opened a bottle of wine and toasted my reflection in the window. "Here's to finding out what dead weight can accomplish when it stops holding other people up," I said to the stranger looking back at me. She smiled, and for the first time in months, I smiled back. Finding an apartment in Austin proved easier than finding myself, but both happened faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, I was living in a sleek downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of view that made me feel like I was starring in someone else's much more interesting life. The real estate agent, a spirited woman named Linda Rodriguez, had looked at my references and financial statements with barely concealed curiosity. "Seattle tech executive looking for a complete change," she mused, scrolling through my rental application. "We get a lot of that here. Austin has a way of calling to people who need to reinvent themselves." "Is it that obvious?" I asked. Linda laughed. "Honey, I've been selling dreams disguised as real estate for 20 years. You've got that look of someone who's just figured out they've been living someone else's life." She wasn't wrong. Everything about Austin felt like permission to be someone new. The music spilling out of every restaurant, the food trucks parked on corners like promises of adventure, the way strangers made eye contact and actually smiled instead of hurrying past with their heads down. My condo came furnished, which was perfect since I'd left everything in Seattle except my clothes and a few pieces of jewelry Robert had given me. I kept his wedding ring on a chain around my neck, not out of inability to let go, but as a reminder of the woman who'd been brave enough to love deeply once and could do it again. The first thing I did after signing the lease was buy a proper coffee machine. Not the fancy espresso contraption David had insisted we needed for the office, but a simple drip coffee maker that reminded me of the early days when Robert and I had worked from our kitchen table, dreaming of building something meaningful. While the coffee brewed on my second morning in Austin, I did something that would have horrified the old Margaret. I opened my laptop and started planning revenge. Not the messy, emotional kind that would make me look desperate, but the strategic, businesslike kind that would make David wish he'd thought twice before calling his mother dead weight. I pulled up the client database Janet had sent me and started analyzing patterns. Anderson Tech Solutions had built its reputation on one thing: taking chaotic startups and turning them into functional businesses. We were the company you called when your brilliant idea was being strangled by poor management, unclear processes, and founders who thought passion was a substitute for planning. The irony wasn't lost on me that David was about to learn this lesson firsthand. As I studied the client list, I noticed something interesting. Over the past 5 years, nearly 60% of our most successful projects had been managed directly by me. Not supervised, not overseen, but actually managed. I had been the one on the phone at midnight with panicked CEOs. I had been the one mediating between brilliant engineers and practical business needs. I had been the one turning chaos into profit. David knew how to present solutions I had designed, but did he know how to create them? My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. Unknown Texas number. "Margaret Anderson," I answered, using my full name for the first time in years. "Ms. Anderson, this is Kevin Murphy from Murphy Ventures. I got your contact information from Linda Rodriguez. She mentioned you might be available for consulting work." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. I hadn't told Linda I was looking for work. "What kind of consulting?" "Management restructuring for a growing tech startup. We've raised $12 million in funding, but we're hemorrhaging money and can't figure out why. Linda said you had experience in exactly this type of situation." 3 days later, I was sitting in Murphy Ventures' conference room, looking at financial statements that told a story I'd seen dozens of times before. Brilliant product, passionate team, and management systems that belonged in a college dorm room rather than a $12 million company. Kevin Murphy was a software genius in his early 30s with the kind of manic energy that built empires or burned them down, depending on who was steering the ship. His team consisted of 6 engineers, 2 marketing specialists, and a bookkeeper who looked like she was having a nervous breakdown in slow motion. "We're spending money faster than we're making it," Kevin explained, gesturing at charts that resembled abstract art more than business analytics. "We landed 3 major contracts last month, which should be great news, but somehow we're deeper in debt than before." I spent the next 4 hours doing what I'd done for 2 decades at Anderson Tech, asking uncomfortable questions, untangling financial knots, and identifying the gap between what the company was doing and what it thought it was doing. The problem was classic startup syndrome. Too much growth too fast without the infrastructure to support it. They were delivering excellent products, but losing money on every sale because they hadn't accounted for the true cost of rapid scaling. "Here's what's going to happen," I told Kevin as I wrapped up my analysis. "You're going to implement activity-based costing, restructure your project management workflow, and establish clear boundaries between development time and delivery timelines. You're also going to hire a real CFO and stop trying to run finances on spreadsheets and hope." Kevin looked at me like I'd just performed a magic trick. "How long would something like that take to implement?" 6 weeks for the framework, 3 months for full integration," I said, gathering my notes. "It's not complicated, but it requires discipline and someone who understands how to build sustainable systems. Would you be interested in overseeing the project?" I pretended to consider it, but inside I was smiling. "My rate is $400 an hour, plus a percentage of cost savings achieved in the first year." Kevin didn't even blink. "When can you start?" Walking out of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Robert's death: professional excitement. Not the grim satisfaction of fixing other people's mistakes, but the genuine thrill of building something better from the ground up. That evening, I called Linda Rodriguez to thank her for the referral. "How did you know I was looking for work?" I asked. "Honey," she laughed, "I didn't know for sure. But I've seen enough people starting over to recognize someone who's got skills but needs an opportunity to prove they still matter. Besides, Kevin's been looking for someone with your exact background for months." As I hung up, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in years, someone had recommended me for who I was, not who I was married to or related to. The old Margaret had always been introduced as Robert's wife or David's mother. The new Margaret was being hired as Margaret Anderson, the woman who could solve problems other people couldn't even identify. That night, I opened a bottle of Texas wine and called it a celebration, not just of landing my first independent client, but of discovering that 30 years of experience didn't disappear just because someone called you dead weight. In fact, I was beginning to suspect that dead weight, when properly distributed, could become the foundation for something much stronger than whatever David thought he was building without me. Success in Austin started small and grew like wildfire, which made sense since everything in Texas seemed to come with extra heat. Within 6 months, I'd gone from 1 desperate startup to 5 thriving clients. And the transformation was spectacular enough to make me wonder why I'd spent so many years playing second fiddle in my own life. Murphy Ventures became my flagship success story. Kevin's $12 million headache turned into a $20 million profit machine once we implemented proper cost controls and project management systems. More importantly, Kevin started bragging about his genius consultant from Seattle to anyone who would listen. Word spread through Austin's tight-knit entrepreneurial community like gossip at a church social. Suddenly, my phone was ringing with calls from venture capitalists, startup founders, and even established companies who'd heard about the woman who could transform business chaos into sustainable profits. I established Anderson Consulting from my downtown condo, but within 3 months I needed real office space. I found a converted warehouse in East Austin with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and enough character to make corporate clients feel like they were getting something special. My assistant, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya Patel, had business sense that rivaled most MBA graduates and an ability to manage my calendar like a military operation. She'd graduated from UT's business school and was working for a startup that folded 3 weeks after I hired her away from them. "Your 10 o'clock is here," Priya announced on a Thursday morning in October, 8 months after I'd left Seattle. Rebecca Martinez from CloudSync Solutions. Rebecca was exactly the type of client I'd become known for helping. Brilliant engineer, successful product launch, and business operations held together with caffeine and prayer. Her cloud-based project management software was gaining traction, but her company was hemorrhaging talent faster than she could hire replacements. "I've heard you're the person to call when everything's on fire," Rebecca said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Well, everything's on fire. For the next hour, Rebecca painted a picture I'd seen countless times. Rapid growth without infrastructure, passionate employees burning out from chaos, and revenue that looked impressive on paper but disappeared into operational inefficiencies. "Your turnover rate is killing you," I told her after reviewing her numbers. "You're spending more on recruiting and training than you're saving by keeping costs low. Every employee who leaves takes institutional knowledge with them, and every replacement starts the learning curve from zero." "But we can't afford to pay competitive salaries yet," Rebecca protested. "We're still establishing market position." I leaned back in my chair, remembering similar conversations from my Seattle days. "Rebecca, what if I told you that properly managed employees could generate 30% more revenue per person, and that increased productivity would more than pay for salary improvements?" Her eyes lit up with the kind of hope that made consulting work addictive. "Is that actually possible? Give me 8 weeks and I'll show you." That project became the template for what I started calling the Anderson Method: systematic analysis of workflow inefficiencies, strategic restructuring of team responsibilities, implementation of performance metrics that actually mattered, and creation of sustainable growth frameworks that could scale with company expansion. The results spoke for themselves. CloudSync's employee retention jumped to 92%. Their per-employee revenue increased by 38%. Their client satisfaction scores improved dramatically because projects were being delivered on time and within budget. Rebecca became another evangelist, and suddenly I was fielding calls from companies in Dallas, Houston, and even back west in California. By December, I had 11 active clients and a waiting list that stretched into the following spring. I hired 2 additional consultants, both experienced professionals who'd been underutilized by larger firms that didn't recognize their potential. Dr. Sarah Kim was a former operations manager who'd been let go from a Fortune 500 company during restructuring, despite having transformed their supply chain efficiency. Marcus Thompson was a retired military logistics expert who understood complex systems better than anyone I'd ever met. Together, we were becoming something Austin's business community had never seen before: a consulting firm that actually delivered transformational results instead of expensive reports that collected dust on executive shelves. The financial numbers were staggering. In my first year in Austin, Anderson Consulting generated more revenue than my 30% stake in Anderson Tech Solutions had ever produced. More importantly, every dollar was money I'd earned through my own expertise and effort, not inherited through marriage or family connections. I celebrated my first anniversary in Texas by signing a lease on a larger office space and taking my entire team to the best steakhouse in Austin. As we sat around the table, toasting our success with good wine and better company, Priya asked the question I'd been expecting for months. "Margaret, do you ever miss Seattle?" I thought about David, still running Anderson Tech Solutions with the same arrogance that had driven me away. I thought about the house I'd shared with Robert, now sold to strangers who would never know the dreams that had been planned in its kitchen. I thought about the woman I'd been, always supporting other people's ambitions instead of pursuing her own. "I miss who I thought I was going to become there," I said finally. "But I don't miss who I actually was." Sarah raised her glass. "To becoming exactly who we were meant to be." As we clinked glasses, my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown Seattle number. I glanced at it and nearly choked on my wine. "Mom, I heard about your consulting firm from Kevin Murphy. We need to talk." "David." I showed the message to Priya, who read it with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering termites in your foundation. "How did he get Kevin's contact information?" she asked. That was an excellent question, and one that deserved a strategic answer. David had clearly been tracking my activities, which meant he'd probably heard about Anderson Consulting's success. The question was whether he was calling because he needed my help or because he wanted to offer some kind of reconciliation. Either way, I wasn't the same woman who'd walked out of that boardroom a year ago. The Margaret Anderson who'd built a successful consulting firm from scratch wasn't interested in playing supporting roles in other people's stories. But she was very interested in seeing what her son wanted badly enough to track her down after a year of radio silence. I finished my wine and turned off my phone without responding. If David wanted to talk, he could wait until I decided I was ready to listen. After all, dead weight doesn't come running just because someone calls. David showed up at my Austin office on a Tuesday morning in March, looking like success had been treating him about as well as a bad case of food poisoning. The confident executive who'd called me dead weight 2 years earlier had been replaced by a man with stress lines around his eyes and the kind of desperate energy that screamed trouble. I wasn't expecting him. Priya buzzed my office around 10:30 with barely concealed amusement in her voice. "Margaret, there's a David Anderson here to see you. Says he's your son. He doesn't have an appointment, and his attitude suggests he thinks that shouldn't matter." Perfect. Some things never changed. "Send him in," I said, closing the quarterly revenue reports I'd been reviewing. Reports that showed Anderson Consulting was now generating more annual income than Anderson Tech Solutions had ever achieved in its best year. David walked into my office like he owned it, but I could see the hesitation underneath his bluster. He was wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the fact that he'd lost weight, and not in a good way. His eyes moved around my space with obvious surprise, taking in the polished conference table, the wall of client testimonials, and the Austin skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Nice setup, Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited. "Quite a step up from that little condo Linda Rodriguez told me about." So he had been tracking me. Interesting. "Hello, David," I replied calmly. "I'd say this is a pleasant surprise, but we both know I'd be lying." His attempted smile looked more like a grimace. "Can't a son visit his mother?" "A son can do whatever he wants," I said. "The question is what this particular son wants badly enough to fly to Austin without calling first." For a moment, the mask slipped completely. David looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and about 10 years older than his 34 years. "We're having some challenges at Anderson Tech," he admitted. "Nothing major, just some growing pains with our newer clients." I waited. 2 years of running my own company had taught me the value of strategic silence. "The truth is," David continued, his voice losing its confident edge, "we've lost 3 major contracts in the past 6 months. Morrison Industries, TechFlow Solutions, and Pacific Dynamics all terminated their agreements early. Those were all clients I had personally managed for years. Clients whose projects I had designed and whose trust I had earned through late-night crisis calls and weekend troubleshooting sessions." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not for David, but for Janet Morrison and the other employees whose livelihoods depended on keeping the company afloat. "The thing is," David pressed on, "these clients are saying they want to work with you personally. Apparently, they've been following your work here in Austin, and they're impressed by what you've built." There it was, the real reason for his visit. "What exactly are you proposing, David?" He leaned forward, putting on his best negotiating face. "A partnership. Anderson Tech Solutions and Anderson Consulting working together. We could combine resources, share clients, maybe even consider a merger down the line." I almost laughed. Almost. "Let me understand this correctly," I said. 2 years ago, you called me dead weight and humiliated me in front of our employees. Now you want to partner with me? Because those same employees are losing the clients I spent years cultivating. Look, I was young and stupid, okay? David's frustration was showing. I made mistakes, but we're family, and family should support each other. Family, I repeated slowly. "David, when I was grieving your father's death and struggling to find my place in the company we built together, did you support me? I was trying to step up, to take responsibility. You were trying to push me out so you could take credit for work I had done." My voice remained level, but I felt steel beneath it. "And you succeeded. So what's changed?" David's shoulders sagged slightly. "Everything's harder than I thought it would be. Dad made it look easy, and you—" He paused, struggling with words. "You always made it look effortless. I didn't realize how much of the client relationship management you were handling." Finally, some honesty. David, I said gently, running a consulting business isn't about looking successful in board meetings. It's about solving problems other people can't solve. Building trust with clients who are trusting you with their livelihoods and creating systems that work even when everything else is falling apart. I know that now, he said quietly. Will you consider it? The partnership? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Austin's skyline. 2 years ago, this view hadn't existed in my life. 2 years ago, I had been living in someone else's shadow, grateful for whatever role they allowed me to play. Now I was the CEO of a company that had never had a single dissatisfied client. I was personally training the next generation of business consultants. I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of. And more importantly, I was making it on my own terms. David, I said, turning back to face him, I want you to do something for me. Hope flickered across his face. Anything. I want you to think very carefully about what you're offering me. You want access to my clients, my methods, my reputation, and my expertise. What exactly would I be getting from this partnership? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Because from where I'm sitting, I continued, you're asking me to solve the problems you created by eliminating me from the company in the first place. You're asking me to repair relationships with clients you alienated. You're asking me to bail out the business you insisted you could run better without your deadweight mother. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I built Anderson Consulting from nothing, I said finally. No family connections, no inherited client base, no husband's reputation to lean on. Just my own skills and determination. Why would I give up my independence to fix someone else's mistakes? David stared at me with something that might have been respect if it hadn't been mixed with so much desperation. What would it take? He asked quietly. That's when I smiled. The kind of smile that comes from finally holding all the cards in a game you'd been losing for years. David, I said, there's nothing you have that I want, but there might be something I have that you need. I walked back to my desk and pulled out a business card. When you're ready to hire Anderson Consulting as an outside contractor at our standard rates to help rebuild what you've broken, give Priya a call to schedule an appointment. She handles all my new client inquiries. The look on his face was worth every moment of humiliation I'd endured 2 years earlier. You're treating me like any other client? He asked, incredulous. David, I said, walking to my office door and opening it, you are just another client. The question is whether you're going to be a successful one. As he stood to leave, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The pure satisfaction of being needed by someone who had once discarded me and having the power to set the terms of engagement. Deadweight? Indeed. David hired Anderson Consulting 3 weeks later, and watching him sign our standard contractor agreement was almost as satisfying as my first $1 million revenue quarter. Almost, because the best revenge is always professional success served with a side of poetic justice. The contract signing took place in my conference room, with Priya handling the paperwork like the consummate professional she'd become. David sat across from me looking like a man who'd swallowed his pride and found it tasted exactly as bitter as expected. Standard consulting rate is $500 per hour, Priya explained, sliding the documents across the polished table. Minimum engagement is 40 hours. Payment terms are net 15, not 30. David's pen hesitated over the signature line. 500? That's higher than what you quoted on the phone. Market rates, I said calmly. Austin's economy has been very good to us. What I didn't mention was that our standard rate for new clients was actually $400 per hour. But David wasn't just any client. He was the client who taught me that family discounts were just another way of undervaluing yourself. He signed. The next morning, I flew to Seattle for the first time in 2 years. Stepping off the plane at SeaTac felt like visiting a past life, complete with the familiar drizzle that seemed determined to remind me why I'd left. Anderson Tech Solutions occupied the same downtown building it always had, but something felt different the moment I walked through the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, looked harried and overwhelmed. The waiting area that had once been immaculate now showed signs of deferred maintenance, worn carpet edges, scuffed furniture, and a general air of barely controlled chaos. Janet Morrison met me at the elevator, and the relief on her face was both gratifying and heartbreaking. "Margaret," she said, embracing me like I'd returned from the dead. Thank God you're here. As we rode up to the executive floor, Janet filled me in on what David had been too proud to admit during his Austin visit. We've lost more than just those 3 big clients, she said quietly. Morrison Industries was just the beginning. Word got out that you weren't with the company anymore, and clients started questioning whether we could deliver the same level of service. How bad is it? Revenue is down 60% from 2 years ago. We've had to lay off 12 people, including Tom Richardson from accounting and Maria Santos from project management. Those names hit like physical blows. Tom had been with us for 8 years. Maria had 2 kids in college. David's been trying to land new clients, Janet continued, but he's struggling with the discovery process. He can identify problems, but he can't design solutions the way you could. The elevator doors opened onto the floor that had once felt like home. Now it felt like a crime scene where someone had murdered efficiency and left chaos to decompose in the conference rooms. David was waiting for us, flanked by the 3 remaining senior consultants, Mark Stevens, Patricia Wells, and James Crawford, all people I'd hired and trained personally. All right, I said, settling into my old chair at the conference table. Let's see what we're working with. For the next 4 hours, they walked me through their current client situations. Each presentation was more devastating than the last. Projects running over budget and behind schedule. Clients expressing dissatisfaction with deliverables. Solutions that addressed symptoms instead of root causes. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery with a butter knife. The Hartwell Industries project, I said, interrupting Mark's explanation of why their inventory management system redesign was 6 weeks overdue. What was your initial assessment of their core problem? Mark shuffled through his notes. Inefficient warehouse layout leading to increased fulfillment times. Wrong, I said simply. Their warehouse layout is fine. Their problem is data integration between their ordering system and their inventory tracking. They're solving the wrong problem, which is why your solution isn't working. The room went quiet. Patricia leaned forward. How could you know that without visiting their facility? Because I helped them implement their current ordering system 4 years ago. And I've seen this exact issue with 3 other clients who have similar software configurations. David's face had taken on the expression of a man watching his house burn down while realizing he'd forgotten to pay his insurance premiums. The Winston Group project, I continued, turning to James. Let me guess. You recommended they restructure their management hierarchy to improve communication flow. Yes, that was our primary recommendation. And how's that working out? James looked uncomfortable. They're experiencing some resistance to change. Of course they are. James, the Winston Group's problem isn't hierarchy. It's that their senior managers don't trust their data because their reporting metrics are measuring the wrong things. You can't fix trust issues by changing the org chart. For every project they presented, I could identify the fundamental flaw in their approach within minutes. Not because I was smarter than them, but because I had years of experience seeing these patterns, and David had never bothered to learn the diagnostic skills that make consulting work effective. As we wrapped up the day, David asked to speak with me privately. How did it get this bad? He asked once we were alone in his office. Robert's old office, I noticed, though David had redecorated with modern furniture that somehow made the space feel smaller. David, I said, consulting isn't just about having business knowledge. It's about pattern recognition, diagnostic thinking, and the ability to see systems rather than symptoms. Those skills take years to develop. Dad made it look easy. Your father spent 20 years learning to make it look easy, and even then, he relied on me for the client relationship management because he understood that his strengths were in business development, not problem solving. David slumped in his chair. What do I do now? For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to come to me when his science projects weren't working, trusting that Mom could fix anything. But this wasn't a science project, and I wasn't just Mom anymore. You have 3 options, I said. Option 1. Hire me for 6 months to redesign your entire consulting methodology and train your team properly. Cost. Approximately $200,000, with no guarantee your remaining clients will stick around long enough to see results. His face went pale. Option 2. Sell Anderson Tech Solutions to a competitor while you still have some assets worth buying. What's option 3? I stood up and gathered my notes. Option 3. Keep doing what you're doing and be out of business within 18 months. As I headed for the door, David called after me. "Margaret, if I choose option 1, would you consider staying permanently? Maybe taking over as CEO again?" I paused with my hand on the doorknob. 2 years ago, that offer would have meant everything to me. Now it just sounded like someone asking me to clean up their mess. "David," I said without turning around, "I already am a CEO. The question is whether you're ready to become a student." That evening, I had dinner with Janet at our old favorite restaurant. Over wine and salmon, she told me things David hadn't mentioned during his Austin visit. "Margaret, there's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "David took out a significant loan against the company assets last year. If we lose any more major clients, we might not be able to make the payments." The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't pretty. David hadn't just damaged the company through incompetence. He'd made financial decisions that put everyone's jobs at risk. "How significant?" I asked. $800,000. I nearly choked on my wine. "For what?" "Office renovation, new equipment, a marketing campaign that never launched properly." Janet's voice was bitter. "He wanted everything to look successful while the actual business was failing." As I flew back to Austin the next morning, I realized David's visit hadn't been about wanting to partner with me. It had been about desperation disguised as family reconciliation. But here's the thing about desperation. It makes people willing to pay premium rates for solutions to problems they created themselves. And after 2 years of building my own empire, I was very good at solving other people's problems for the right price. Saving Anderson Tech Solutions turned out to be like performing emergency surgery on a patient who kept insisting they only had a headache. Every solution revealed 3 new problems, and each problem traced back to decisions David had made while convinced he was being brilliant. I spent the next month commuting between Austin and Seattle, living in extended stay hotels and charging David's company for every hour, every meal, and every mile. Professional courtesy is one thing. Subsidizing someone else's education and humility is another. The loan situation was worse than Janet had initially revealed. David hadn't just borrowed against company assets. He'd personally guaranteed the debt, which meant if Anderson Tech Solutions failed, he'd lose his house, his savings, and his children's college funds. "Why didn't you tell me about the personal guarantee?" I asked him during our 3rd week of intensive client recovery sessions. We were sitting in the conference room at 9 p.m., surrounded by spreadsheets that documented just how spectacularly he'd mismanaged everything I'd spent decades building. "I didn't think it mattered," David said, loosening his tie with hands that had developed a slight tremor over the past few weeks. "I was confident we could turn things around. David, when you're responsible for other people's livelihoods, confidence is not a business strategy." The personal guarantee explained why he'd been so desperate to get me back. This wasn't just about professional embarrassment anymore. It was about financial survival. But as I dug deeper into the company's recent history, I discovered something that made my blood pressure spike in ways that had nothing to do with stress. "Janet," I said, pulling her aside after our morning staff meeting, "I need you to walk me through the Morrison Industries termination again. Specifically, what David told them about why I left the company." Janet looked uncomfortable. "Margaret, I don't think—" "Janet," she sighed. "He told them you'd had some kind of breakdown after Robert's death, that you'd become unreliable, and that the family had to make the difficult decision to remove you from active client management for everyone's safety." The room tilted slightly. "He told our clients I had a breakdown? He said it was early onset dementia, that you'd been showing signs of confusion and memory loss, and that the company had to protect clients from receiving substandard advice. 25 years of marriage to Robert had taught me how to maintain composure in crisis situations. 20 years of business consulting had taught me how to separate emotion from analysis. But sitting in that conference room, listening to Janet describe how my own son had destroyed my professional reputation to cover his own incompetence, I felt something crack inside my chest. "Margaret?" Janet's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I was not all right. I was furious with a clarity that felt like stepping out of fog into blazing sunlight. "Janet, I need you to document everything you just told me. Names, dates, exact quotes if you can remember them. I want it all in writing." That evening, I called my lawyer in Austin. Patricia Chen had been handling my business legal needs since I'd established Anderson Consulting, and she had the kind of sharp analytical mind that made opposing counsel wish they'd chosen different careers. "Margaret, what you're describing could constitute defamation," Patricia said after I'd explained the situation. "Telling clients that you're mentally impaired when you're actually a competitor could be grounds for a significant lawsuit." "I'm not interested in suing my son," I said, "but I am interested in making sure he understands the consequences of his actions." "What kind of consequences?" I looked out my hotel window at Seattle's skyline, thinking about the woman who'd been so desperate for family approval that she'd accepted being called dead weight without fighting back. That woman was gone. The kind that teach people not to lie about their mother's mental health to cover their own failures, I said. The next morning, I called an all-hands meeting. Every remaining employee of Anderson Tech Solutions gathered in the main conference room, including people I'd hired, trained, and mentored for years. David introduced me as our consulting specialist, who's helping us through some transitional challenges. I let him finish his sanitized version of reality before I stood up. "Thank you, David. For those of you who don't know, I'm Margaret Anderson, and I founded this company 26 years ago with my late husband, Robert." I looked around the room at faces that showed confusion, hope, and in some cases, embarrassment. "I understand there's been some confusion about why I'm no longer with Anderson Tech Solutions full-time." David's face had gone pale. "Mom, I don't think—" "I left," I continued, "because my son told me I was dead weight during a board meeting and suggested the company would be better off without me. I moved to Austin, started my own consulting firm, and built it into a more successful operation than Anderson Tech has ever been. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. I'm here now because David hired my company to help fix the problems created by my absence. Over the next month, we'll be implementing new systems, retraining staff, and rebuilding client relationships that were damaged by poor management." I turned to look directly at David. "But first, I think it's important that everyone understand exactly what happened and why, so we can make sure it never happens again." For the next 15 minutes, I laid out the truth, not vindictively, but with the same methodical precision I use to analyze business problems. The humiliation in the boardroom, the lies told to clients about my mental health, the financial decisions that had put everyone's jobs at risk. When I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of David's career plans crumbling into dust. "Any questions?" I asked. Patricia Wells raised her hand tentatively. "Margaret, are you coming back permanently?" "No," I said. "I'm here to clean up a mess, train you all to avoid creating similar messes in the future, and then return to my actual company in Austin." Mark Stevens spoke up. "What happens to us after you leave? That depends on whether you learn from this experience or repeat it." As the meeting broke up, employees approached me individually. Some to apologize for not speaking up during that original board meeting, others to ask if my Austin company was hiring, a few to express relief that finally someone was going to fix what had been broken. David cornered me as I was packing up my notes. "That was completely unnecessary," he said, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. "David," I replied calmly, "everything I said in there was true. If you find the truth unnecessary, that tells me everything I need to know about how you've been running this company. You humiliated me in front of my employees." I paused in gathering my papers and looked at him directly. "Yes," I said, "I did. How did that feel?" The recognition that flickered across his face told me he was finally beginning to understand what he'd put me through 2 years earlier. "Now," I continued, "let's see if you can learn from humiliation the way I did. Because if you can't, then this company really is beyond saving." That night, I sat in my hotel room and did something I hadn't done since leaving Seattle. I let myself grieve. Not for the company, not for the relationships that had been damaged, but for the years I'd spent being smaller than I was capable of being. But grief, I'd learned, could be fuel if you used it correctly. And I had a month of intensive education to deliver to a son who was about to discover what dead weight could accomplish when it decided to become the foundation instead of the burden. Teaching your own son that he doesn't know everything turns out to be more exhausting than rebuilding an entire consulting methodology from scratch. By week 3 of the Anderson Tech Solutions Rehabilitation Project, I was beginning to understand why some animals eat their young. David had agreed to shadow me during client recovery calls. which meant he got to witness firsthand how professional relationships actually work when they're built on competence instead of inherited authority. Our first joint client meeting was with Morrison Industries, the contract David had lost 6 months earlier. Rebecca Morrison had agreed to hear our pitch for renewed engagement, though her initial email had been what diplomatic people call cautiously skeptical. "Margaret," Rebecca said as we settled into her conference room, "I have to admit I was surprised to hear you were back with Anderson Tech. David told us you'd been having health issues." I glanced at David, who suddenly found his legal pad fascinating. "Rebecca, I've never been healthier or more professionally engaged in my life. I spent the last 2 years building a consulting practice in Austin that's been extremely successful. David hired my firm to help restructure Anderson Tech's operations." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "Your firm? Anderson Consulting. We specialize in exactly the type of systematic problem-solving that Morrison Industries needs." For the next hour, I walked Rebecca through a comprehensive analysis of her company's current challenges, complete with specific recommendations that built on work we'd done together 4 years earlier. David sat silently, taking notes and occasionally looking like he wanted to contribute, but couldn't find an opening. "This is exactly what we needed 18 months ago," Rebecca said when I finished my presentation. "Why didn't Anderson Tech Solutions provide this level of analysis then?" The question hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. "Because," I said carefully, "the person who had developed these methodologies was no longer available to implement them." Rebecca nodded slowly, understanding more than I was explicitly saying. "And now? Now Anderson Consulting is available on a contract basis to provide exactly these services." We left that meeting with a signed contract worth $200,000. Not for Anderson Tech Solutions, but for Anderson Consulting, with Anderson Tech handling only the administrative support. David was quiet during the drive back to the office, but I could see him processing what had just happened. "She would have signed with you 18 months ago if I'd known how to present the analysis properly," he said finally. "Yes? How many other clients would have stayed if I'd understood how to maintain the relationships you'd built?" I thought about the dozens of phone calls I'd fielded over the past 2 years from former Anderson Tech clients who'd heard about my Austin practice and wanted to work with me directly. "Most of them," I said. That evening, David asked me to dinner at the restaurant where Robert and I used to celebrate major contract wins. As we sat across from each other in a booth I'd shared with his father countless times, David asked the question I'd been expecting for weeks. "What would it take for you to come back permanently?" I sipped my wine and considered how to answer honestly without being cruel. "David, coming back permanently would require me to give up a company I built from scratch, move away from a city I love, and work for someone who spent 2 years telling people I was mentally incompetent. What exactly would motivate me to make those sacrifices?" "Family," he said immediately. "This is Dad's company." "Our company?" "No," I said gently. "This was Dad's and my company. You made it clear 2 years ago that you considered it your company and me an obstacle. You can't retroactively change that decision now that you need my help." David's shoulders sagged. "I was wrong. I was arrogant and stupid, and I made terrible decisions. But we're family, and families forgive each other." "I have forgiven you," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the consequences of your actions don't exist. You destroyed client relationships, damaged employee morale, and made financial commitments you couldn't honor. Those are business problems, not family problems. So you'll just let the company fail?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how David still viewed the situation. In his mind, I was responsible for saving what he had broken, simply because I was his mother. "David," I said, "I've already saved the company. Anderson Consulting now holds the contracts that keep Anderson Tech Solutions afloat. Your employees have jobs because my firm is generating the revenue that pays their salaries. But it's not the same. No, it's not. It's better. It's a sustainable business model based on actual competence instead of inherited relationships." The next week brought news that changed everything. Patricia Wells knocked on my hotel room door at 7 in the morning with an expression that suggested either very good news or very bad news. "Margaret, you need to see this," she said, handing me a printout of an email. The email was from Bradley Morrison, Rebecca's husband and Morrison Industries CFO. The subject line read, "Confidential information regarding Anderson Tech Solutions." The message was brief but devastating. Margaret, thought you should know that David Anderson approached 3 of our current vendors last month, offering to provide consulting services identical to what your Austin firm delivers. He presented materials that appeared to be your proprietary methodologies and claimed he'd developed them himself. 2 of the vendors expressed interest in switching from their current consultants to Anderson Tech. I thought you should be aware of this situation. I read the email 3 times, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. David hadn't just been incompetent. He'd been actively trying to steal my business methods and pass them off as his own work. Patricia, I said quietly, I need you to gather documentation on every methodology, process analysis, and system design I've developed since leaving Anderson Tech. Everything that's proprietary to Anderson Consulting. You think he's been copying your work? I think my son has been trying to steal my intellectual property while I've been helping him save his company. That afternoon, I confronted David in his office. I laid Bradley's email on his desk and watched his face confirm everything I needed to know. David, I said, we need to discuss your understanding of intellectual property law. It's not what it looks like, he said, but his voice carried the guilt of someone who knew exactly what it looked like. What it looks like is corporate theft. What it looks like is corporate theft. What it looks like is you taking methodologies I developed for my company and presenting them as your own work to steal my clients. You developed those methods while you worked here originally. I developed them for Anderson Consulting using my own time, my own resources and my own expertise. They belong to me, not to you. David's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Everything you know, you learned working for this company. Everything you know, you learned from me, I replied evenly. The difference is that I'm not trying to steal credit for your work. As I walked out of his office, I realized our month-long rehabilitation project had just become something else entirely, a masterclass in why some people never learn that shortcuts don't lead to success. They just lead to deeper holes. The call from my attorney came at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I'd discovered David's intellectual property theft. Patricia Chen's voice carried the kind of excitement that meant either very good news for me or very bad news for someone else. Margaret, you need to get to my office immediately. I've discovered something about David's loan situation that changes everything. I'd been planning to return to Austin that weekend. My contracted month with Anderson Tech Solutions nearly complete. The company was stable, employees were retrained, and 3 major clients had renewed their contracts with Anderson Consulting. David had seemed to accept the new reality where he ran administrative operations while I controlled the actual consulting work. Apparently, I'd been naive. Patricia's office overlooked Elliott Bay, and on clear days you could see the Olympic Mountains. But that morning, thick clouds obscured everything beyond the waterfront, which seemed fitting for what I was about to discover. Margaret, Patricia said, sliding a thick folder across her desk, you know how we were researching David's $800,000 loan to understand your liability exposure? You said the company assets were collateral, not my personal holdings. That's what I thought. But buried in the loan documentation is something called a successor liability clause. It's unusual language that I've never seen in a standard business loan. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. What does that mean? It means if David defaults on the loan, and if the company is transferred to another family member within 5 years of the loan origination, that family member becomes personally responsible for the debt. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Patricia, I don't own any part of Anderson Tech Solutions anymore. I gave up my shares when I left. That's where it gets interesting, Patricia said, opening another folder. David never filed the paperwork to officially transfer your shares. According to state records, you still own 30% of Anderson Tech Solutions. I stared at her. That's impossible. I signed papers. You signed an intent to transfer. But the actual transfer was never completed with the Secretary of State, which means legally you're still a part owner of a company that owes $800,000. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If David's loan went into default, I would be legally responsible for debt I'd never agreed to take on, secured by a company I'd thought I no longer owned. Patricia, I said carefully, what would happen if David declared bankruptcy? The successor liability clause would kick in automatically. Your Austin assets, your house, your business accounts, everything would be fair game for debt collection. I sat back in my chair, processing the magnitude of what David had done. He hadn't just been stealing my intellectual property and trying to poach my clients. He'd structured his loan in a way that would make me financially responsible if his company failed. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "I discovered it yesterday while reviewing the final documents." "Margaret, there's more." She pulled out another set of papers. "David took out the loan 14 months ago, 2 months after you'd established Anderson Consulting and started generating significant revenue. The timing suggests this was planned." "Planned how?" "Think about it. He pushes you out of the company, waits for you to become financially successful elsewhere, then structures debt that would transfer to you if his business fails. If Anderson Tech goes under, you become responsible for his mistakes while he walks away clean." The coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering against the hardwood floor. Patricia moved to clean it up, but I sat frozen, staring at the loan documents that revealed just how calculating my son had been. "Margaret," Patricia said gently, "I think David's been planning to bankrupt Anderson Tech Solutions and stick you with the debt from the beginning." Everything fell into place with sickening clarity. David's visit to Austin hadn't been about reconciliation or partnership. It had been reconnaissance. He'd needed to verify that I was financially successful enough to cover his debts before he pulled the trigger on his escape plan. The consulting contract, the month of rehabilitation work, even this morning's loan revelation, all of it had been designed to put me in the perfect position to become financially liable for $800,000 of debt I'd never agreed to take on. "What are my options?" I asked. "Legally, you can demand immediate completion of the share transfer to remove your ownership stake. But if Anderson Tech Solutions is already insolvent, transferring ownership might trigger the successor liability clause anyway. And if I don't transfer ownership, then you're a part owner of a company that's about to default on a massive loan." I stood up and walked to Patricia's window, looking out at the gray Seattle sky that suddenly seemed to match my mood perfectly. "Patricia, what if Anderson Tech Solutions became profitable enough to service the loan payments? That would require a significant infusion of capital or a dramatic increase in revenue." "How significant?" "At minimum, $400,000 in new business over the next 12 months. I turned back to face her, feeling something sharp and cold crystallizing in my chest. What if Anderson Consulting merged with Anderson Tech Solutions, with me as majority owner and CEO? Patricia's eyebrows rose. That would certainly generate sufficient revenue. But Margaret, why would you want to take over a company that your son used to trap you financially? The answer came to me with perfect clarity. Because sometimes the best way to escape a trap is to spring it yourself, on your own terms. That afternoon, I called David and asked him to meet me at the office. When he arrived, I had all the loan documentation spread across the conference table like evidence at a trial. "David," I said as he sat down, "we need to discuss your understanding of family loyalty." He looked at the papers and his face went white. "Mom, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why you took out a loan designed to make me financially responsible for your failures? Can you explain why you never completed my share transfer, so I'd still be legally liable for company debts?" "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said weakly. "How was it supposed to happen, David?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd been caught and knew it. "I thought you'd come back," he whispered. "I thought if the company was in enough trouble, you'd have to come back and fix it. I never meant for you to be hurt financially." "David," I said gently, "what you meant doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you did." I stood up and gathered the loan documents. "Tomorrow morning, I'm filing paperwork to assume majority control of Anderson Tech Solutions. I'm restructuring the debt, reorganizing operations, and merging both companies under new management." "You're taking over?" "I'm taking back what was always mine," I said. "The only question is whether you'll be staying as an employee or leaving voluntarily." As I walked toward the door, David called after me. "Mom, what if I refuse? What if I fight the takeover?" I paused and turned back to face him. "David," I said with a smile that felt like ice, "dead weight doesn't get to choose whether it sinks or swims, but it can choose whether it goes down quietly or makes a scene that embarrasses everyone." 24 hours later, I owned 75% of Anderson Tech Solutions, and my son was learning what it felt like to work for someone who didn't confuse family relationships with business competence. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming successful enough to save the people who tried to destroy you. 6 months after David's loan trap exploded in his face, I stood in the executive conference room of Anderson Technologies, the newly merged powerhouse that combined the best of both my companies, watching Seattle's tech leaders applaud my keynote presentation on sustainable business growth through authentic leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated for success that had grown directly from my son's attempt to financially destroy me. David sat in the back row, wearing the expression of someone who'd learned that trying to outmaneuver your mother is like challenging a chess master to checkers. You might think you understand the game, but you're not even playing the same sport. After the presentation, Rebecca Morrison approached me with a champagne glass and the kind of smile that comes from watching justice served with professional excellence. "Margaret," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "when I heard you'd taken over Anderson Tech, I wasn't sure what to expect. This is beyond anything I could have imagined." She was right to be impressed. In 6 months, I'd transformed a failing consulting firm into the Pacific Northwest's most sought-after business transformation company. Revenue had increased by 300%. Employee retention was at 98%. Client satisfaction scores were higher than anything the industry had ever seen. More importantly, I'd done it all while carrying the $800,000 debt David had tried to saddle me with. Every loan payment became a reminder that financial traps only work if you can't generate enough success to turn them into stepping stones. "Mrs. Anderson?" A young reporter from Seattle Business Monthly appeared at my elbow. "Could I ask you a few questions about your remarkable comeback story?" "Of course," I said, though I was beginning to understand that what the media called a comeback was actually just the story of a woman who'd finally stopped allowing other people to define her worth. "Is it true that your son originally forced you out of the company you founded?" "My son made a business decision based on incomplete information," I replied diplomatically. "It ultimately led to opportunities neither of us could have anticipated. And now he works for you?" I glanced toward the back of the room where David was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with one of our new junior consultants. Over the past 6 months, he'd slowly begun learning the skills he should have developed years earlier: how to listen to clients, how to analyze problems systematically, how to design solutions that actually solved the root causes instead of just addressing symptoms. "David is learning the business the way everyone should learn it," I said, "from the ground up, with no shortcuts." That evening, I sat in my new office, Robert's old office, which I'd reclaimed and redecorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture that actually invited collaboration, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed just how spectacular our growth had been. A knock on my door interrupted my analysis. David stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old and had broken my favorite vase while playing baseball in the house. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He handed me one of the coffee cups and settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Margaret," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "Mom, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months. Take your time. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About the business. About what leadership actually means." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "I thought being CEO meant making decisions and having people follow them. I didn't understand that it meant taking responsibility for everyone who trusted you to make the right decisions." I waited, sensing there was more. When I set up that loan structure, when I tried to trap you financially, I told myself it was strategy, that I was being clever, finding a way to force you back into the company. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "But the truth is, I was scared. Scared that without you, I'd fail. And instead of admitting that, I tried to manipulate you into saving me." "David," I said gently, "fear makes people do terrible things to the people they love. The question is what you do after you realize how terrible those things were." "What I'm doing is learning from the best teacher I ever had," he said. "Even if it took me 35 years to figure out I should have been paying attention all along." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking our coffee and watching the Seattle skyline light up as evening settled over the city. "Margaret," David said finally, "do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" "Really? Forgive me?" I thought about the woman who'd walked out of this same office 3 years earlier, humiliated and dismissed, and convinced her best years were behind her. Then I thought about the woman who'd walked back into it 6 months ago as the owner of the most successful consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest. "David," I said, "I forgave you the moment I realized that your worst decision led to my best life." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you hadn't called me dead weight and pushed me out of this company, I never would have discovered what I was capable of building on my own. I never would have learned that being discarded by the people you love doesn't diminish your value. It just reveals how much they underestimated what they were throwing away." David's eyes filled with tears. "So you're grateful I sabotaged you?" "I'm grateful that you gave me permission to stop making myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations," I said. "I'm grateful that you forced me to discover that a woman who's been called deadweight can still build an empire, especially when she stops carrying anyone else's baggage." 3 years ago, my son had humiliated me in front of a boardroom full of people and told me I was worthless. Today, those same people worked for me, and the company David thought he could run without me was thriving under my leadership. But the real victory wasn't professional success or financial security, or even the satisfaction of proving David wrong. The real victory was looking in the mirror each morning and seeing Margaret Anderson, not Robert's widow, not David's mother, not someone defined by her relationships to other people, but a woman who'd learned that being discarded was sometimes the first step toward discovering your actual worth. As David left my office that evening, he paused in the doorway. "Mom," he said, "what would you have done if I'd never called you back to help with the company?" I smiled, thinking about the thriving Austin office, the clients who'd followed me from Seattle, and the life I'd built from absolute scratch. "David," I said, "I would have kept building my empire and never looked back. The only difference is that now I get to run both companies instead of just one." After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my office window, looking out at the city where I'd been dismissed as dead weight 3 years earlier. Tomorrow, the Seattle Times would run a feature story about Anderson Technology's meteoric rise, with my photo on the business section's front page. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just becoming so successful that the people who discarded you end up working for you, and grateful for the opportunity. And sometimes, when you're sipping wine in the CEO office of the company your son tried to steal from you, dead weight turns out to be the perfect foundation for building something magnificent. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.